Good evening, everybody. I hope, yes, participants are joining rapidly. Welcome to this, the third virtual evidence session of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Artificial Intelligence, which I co-chair. I'm Stephen Metcalfe. I co-chair with my colleague from the House of Lords, Lord Tim Clement-Jones. We moved early during this pandemic onto conducting virtual evidence sessions, and I think it's worked incredibly well, both in terms of participation, but also in allowing a larger number of people to hear the evidence that we gather that leads to the reports that we publish. None of this would be possible, well, of course, without the excellent services of the Big Innovation Centre, and I say at every meeting how grateful I and Tim are to Birgitte and all her team and the Big Innovation Centre for facilitating this and making it possible for us to be one of the most active all-party parliamentary groups in Parliament. So thank you again publicly, Birgitte and team, for all you do. So this evening we're going to take evidence on the use of AI in corporate decision making, and we have a fantastic panel of speakers who are going to help us through that topic, which I hope will lead to lots of questions and comments. Now, obviously, if we were doing this in committee room 4 in the House of Lords, people would be trying to catch my eye and I would be marshalling them towards individual speakers, but obviously that's not easily possible when we're conducting a Zoom meeting. So I have a couple of house rules. One is to use the chat facility. If you want to add a comment or a question, please enter it into the chat. There is also a Q&A section, so perhaps we should use the question and answer section to do that. What will then happen is Desiree, who helps run the AI group, will curate the questions, and then when we get to the correct point, I will then go to her and she can tell me who we're going to for the first question, and I will then come to and call upon them to ask their question in person. The other rule is, as I'm sure you've all done this many times now, is wherever possible, please keep yourself on mute, otherwise we can get terrible howl rounds and it just distracts from what is actually being said. Now, before I invite our first speaker to address us, I just want to hand over to Birgitte Andersen from the Big Innovation Centre, who just wants to say a few words. I'm then going to go to my co-chair, Tim Clement-Jones, who will lay out a little bit of background for this, and then I will call upon David Petrie to present for 5 to 6 minutes. So, Birgitte, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen Metcalfe. I want to welcome everybody, but also say that there is a great both public and private interest and of course economic benefit in ensuring here now that we have effective and responsible corporate finance to support business innovation. Clearly here we need to engage with new markets, we need to support new technologies, we need to close new deals, we need to grow new ventures, and we need to ensure that everybody can access equity capital, alternative finance, etc. This has become even more urgent now here in the aftermath or due to the impact of COVID-19. Now we really need to support both innovation, but also public and private purpose. And to build these new markets has never been more important. Therefore, it's very, very happy, or we're very delighted to see that the panel here really is the ecosystem. We don't only have the lawmakers, but we really also have those in the finance sector. We have public finance, we've got Innovate UK, we've got the Department of Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, and of course we have investment companies, and we have those in corporate advisory on investment. So really, really warm welcome to everybody. I also want to say that artificial intelligence affects both operational and decision-making processes that are underpinning this investment here moving forward. And now we've even come to the point where we're talking about augmented decision-making at the board level of companies making decisions. And we are living in an era where data ethics, algorithm transparency, corporate social responsibility, etc., has come to the forefront. But what does good looks like? And we are hopefully about to find out in this meeting here. And I would therefore also like to thank you, the Institute for Chartered Accountants, who has really been very close in making this meeting here with us such a great success. So thank you very much for this. And finally, I want to say that from a personal level, that this here meeting really puts together 3 topics of big innovations and interest. We have always been interested in access to finance and the role of investment in innovative companies full of intangible assets and growth potential. We are interested in the enterprise adoption of AI, and of course, corporate boards and purposeful decision making is something that's very close to our heart. So I look forward to a discussion, and I will now hand back to the chairs, and we can continue the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Birgitte. Tim, did you want to?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I certainly do, and I just wanted to add my thanks to those of Birgitte, to the ICAEW, and I've got a sort of, I suppose, I'm a bit party pre, since I'm on the advisory board of the corporate finance faculty of the ICAEW, and I was privileged enough to chair the committee that produced a report into corporate finance advisory and AI, which wasn't just about the operation of AI and the way it could be used for corporate finance transactions. It covered the ethical areas and so on. And of course, that is really the way in which AI itself is shaking up the whole world of corporate governance. And the wonderful thing about today is that we have speakers who can speak both from, if you like, the particular in terms of corporate finance, but also in terms of the overarching corporate governance and AI point of view, because I do believe that unless we get it right, we won't avoid over-regulation, if you like, in this area. The whole purpose of ethical principles and so on is very useful, but unless they're operationalized and they're turned into corporate governance standards, then it means that actually what legislators are going to have to do, people like myself and Stephen, and Chris are going to have to do, is then erect a regulation. And the more we can embed ethics in standards of corporate behavior, the better it will be in terms of allowing innovation and initiative. So I think that's where I would come from. And of course, the Big Innovation Centre has been a pioneer in terms of establishing principles about the purposeful company for quite some period of time. And I do believe that AI married to things like the Sustainable Development Goals mean that the time of the purposeful company is rapidly coming down the track. And I think things like the B Corp as well are also relevant to all of that. And of course, we're going to hear from our speakers today about that agenda. So Stephen, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Excellent. Right. So I'm going to invite our first speaker to talk to us for approximately 5 minutes. To all the speakers, if I can ask you to try and keep a sharp eye on how long you're speaking for. It's difficult for me to interrupt you without disrupting your flow. So if you can try and make sure that you don't go over the sort of 5-6 minute limit, that would be very useful. And our first speaker is David Petrie, and David is the head of corporate finance from the Institute of Chartered Accountants. And I would also like to add my thanks to the Institute for its help in setting up this meeting and its getting it arranged with us. So thank you very much. And David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and good evening, everyone. And thanks also to Tim and to Professor Andersen and the very many members and supporters of the APPG for inviting me on behalf of the ICAEW to begin this evidence meeting on what is such an important subject. So just to put everything in context, during the past few weeks and months of the COVID-19 crisis, at the ICAEW, we've been working very closely with the UK government, with the Bank of England, the British Business Bank, and the Institute's members to develop and improve the emergency measures to get cash to companies and, of course, to their employees. And AI-based technologies are already being used in that context. And also looking ahead to the recovery from the crisis, it's very important to consider carefully the potential benefits and risks of AI-based applications for companies, investors, advisors, and our wider society. Now, this is a subject that my colleagues and I in the corporate finance faculty researched in depth for the detailed report which Tim has already mentioned, AI in Corporate Advisory, which was devised and co-authored by my colleague Sean Beanie. The report raised some very important points, we feel, and I would like to emphasize some of those for you now. And these are particularly in relation to the application of AI in corporate decision making and also in the context of investment. So firstly, the potential for the use of AI-based technologies in corporate decision making is unquestionable. Although the application is still at an early stage, but yet in other areas it's becoming increasingly important. Boosting public and private investment in advanced technologies will be crucial for a global societal and economic recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Now, corporate investment and corporate finance transactions are indeed a very major form of business activity that has a huge impact on very many industry sectors, on national and regional economies, and also on broader society. In 2019, M&A accounted for nearly $4 trillion in global investment. But in 2020, one thing we can be sure of is that investment will certainly follow a very different pattern, that transactions of all kinds, including finance raising, corporate rescue, and turnaround, will be vital for the economic recovery. Looking how this will take place for urgent investment, decision making, and so on, we're seeing machine learning and machine reading, learning, already being used in virtual data rooms, as it has been for some time, but particularly now for more urgent finance raising, for reviewing legals, for reviewing contracts, in financial analysis, modeling, and for scenario planning. Now, our research on AI and corporate advisory found that the greatest potential for more widespread application in the deal process was in origination. I don't think we'll have too much trouble with that for the moment, but company valuation is another application which is going to be very important, as is due diligence, and then the all-important aspect of post-transaction integration. Turning now to the regulatory and policy implications of our work, ICAEW supports responsible innovation by companies, by financiers, and corporate advisors. And to do this, maintaining public trust is of vital importance. On corporate finance and investment, this is already heavily regulated in many countries, including in the UK, where we're regulated by more than a dozen bodies. So we have therefore recommended that corporate finance practitioners should adopt a principles-based approach that takes into account the ethical codes and protocols developed for professional services and broader investment activity before rushing into additional layers of regulation. On corporate governance, AI-based technologies have already been used to assess many aspects of that area of corporate governance. And just to highlight two examples, in our reports, we quote PwC, where they've used AI to analyze thousands of documents in order to understand the extent to which some of the world's largest companies are in line with their voluntary climate change obligations. And also KPMG have worked with IBM to assess strategic issues in companies, key risks, and who should be responsible for them. And finally, our conclusions were that guidelines on the use and application of AI for corporate decision-making and corporate governance by companies should, and there are 4 points here. Those guidelines should recommend the level of disclosure. They should also include within corporate reporting requirements an explanation as to how AI is being deployed. Thirdly, they should ensure clarity about the various responsibilities of executive and non-executive directors. And finally, encourage measures that boost investment and innovation in AI rather than inadvertently hindering it. Thank you.
Excellent. David, thank you very much indeed. I don't know, Tim, if you had a quick question you wanted to...
Yes, I'd definitely like to come back to David. That was a very impressive overview, David, and clearly adoption is beginning to take place. But is it still all about how effective AI is in solving problems? Or do you get the feeling that actually more firms are now beginning to understand the context, the kind of ethical context in which these technologies need to be applied?
Yes, I think they are. The power of analysis that we've seen in the deal doing process has really brought it home to many company directors that these are technologies that need to be used responsibly. You know, the ability to understand more about a potential acquisition target or an investment, a business you may wish to invest in, than perhaps the existing directors already know themselves, has really brought it home to people that they really have, that with all that information does come a sense of responsibility. And directors are also very familiar with the debate that's raging at the moment as to the nature of the way in which decisions can be made using AI, which may involuntarily discriminate against certain groups. So in both those contexts, I think there's a very strong level of awareness when it comes to transactions of the power and the responsibilities that come with the application of AI.
Excellent. Thank you. Right, I'm going to now move on to our second speaker, who is Yan Chan, who is from EY. Perhaps you'd like to just give a brief intro to yourself, Yan, and then please have 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to give evidence today. My name is Yan Chan. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at EY's Transaction Advisory Services. I lead 2 teams. I have an internal innovation team that looks at how we can disrupt our own EY operations, and also a client-facing team of data scientists focused on how we can deliver better services to our clients around advanced analytics before, during, and after a major corporate event, like, for example, merger and acquisitions. I also recently contributed towards the excellent report that David Petrie just mentioned for the ICAEW, and that's been a really good introduction into the piece I'm going to be talking to today. So as something, a little bit of a background, when I first started working 25 years ago, there was no World Wide Web to research AI on, and today we have easy access to open source software, democratized access to AI tools, and massively online learning available to us. And what that means is everybody can simply download these versions of machine learning tools, low code, no code, drag and drop algorithms. We can start applying neural nets and classification algorithms using tools that we can very easily access. And what that means is that the global competition in this has dramatically increased. There's a huge amount of access to cheap AI capability, and the computational power is now there and cheaper than ever. So the global competition is getting tougher for the UK. It's also worth understanding that it can be difficult to understand the difference between somebody with a huge amount of experience and a new starter without any practice. So with that in mind, we have to sort of look at what AI can really achieve in this space. And with that, it's worth thinking about what AI really can do and what it can't do. And at a very basic level, we know that AI cannot think for itself. It's nowhere near that standard of computational power and sophistication yet. What we do know is that we have a duty to use it to supplement and augment our existing decision-making capability, as was mentioned by Dave in the previous speech. And what AI can do is help us identify good targets for public and private investment. We can simulate outcomes of how investments may turn out through a series of scenario options. And we can use the existing resources we have and optimize them using AI. So there's a whole series of things we can do in a normal situation. Obviously, we're not in a normal situation today, but those are some of the traditional approaches we've taken in the past. And with that, we've often had this fear that AI will take our jobs and that we will potentially be at risk from AI. But in the situation we have at the moment, we really have this opportunity to make use of the resources we have. And the UK has 3 of the top 10 computer science universities in the world. And of those, 45% of the people on those courses are international students from around the world. We have a fantastic opportunity to use those resources and retain them as talented individuals to help drive our post-UK economy and drive the recovery that we will no doubt need to be looking forward to in the near future. And in order to do that, we need to build trust. We need to understand what the machine learning algorithms are doing, how they work, and that comes through a robust testing and review process along the lines of the 2013 Macpherson review for public sector quality assurance around analytical models, and not too different from things like the SOX 404 standards we have in the US. So where we can apply these types of rigor, we can dramatically improve the confidence we have in the types of tools that we are able to deliver. And AI is not just about the science. There's 2 parts to it. There's the data and the science, hence the term data scientist. Typically, a data scientist will spend half of their time working with the data. And one of the issues around best practice that I'd like to instill today is that it's really important that we understand the value and the effort that goes into preparing this data, working with it, cleaning it, understanding it, removing any missing values, fixing dimensions, understanding what really drives the sorts of concepts that we need to base our AI on, and deal with any of those corrupt records or old testing records or missing values. So with all of that in mind, it's really important to understand the time and effort that goes into these. Testing is hard, it takes a lot of energy, and I think every one of the data scientists needs to be prepared to challenge their own results and ideally have peer review, and that's really the best piece of best practice advice I can really encourage. And when it comes down to 2020, what we're looking at the moment is the importance of the approach for driving a recovery for our current situation with COVID-19. And that means looking at things like how AI can help prepare the workforce to return in an optimum manner, how we can apply turnaround to improve our liquidity and cash buffer, and how we can drive better cost reduction through AI by analyzing outliers and drilling into areas of cost that we can help minimize in these times. And with that, we can phase a series of projects, scheduling it using AI approaches, and later on apply codifying expert knowledge into automated systems so we can have intelligent automation using the information and knowledge that we have within our own corporate teams. So I'd like to finish by highlighting a couple of key main points that I'd like you to leave with. And one is the importance of retraining our existing workforce to handle some of those data skills. They may not all be AI specialists, but they can help us improve the quality of the data that feeds our AI. Also looking at how we can encourage best practice and guidance around that aspect of quality review. So looking at quality assurance along the lines of the Macpherson report, And I think where the government can help around that is around the public sector analytical models that are already in place, and also helping businesses to access that existing pool of scientists and data scientists that are currently either furloughed, self-employed, or potentially incentivizing the international students that we have to stay and continue to help us in this. So I'd like to end there by just reiterating those points around my advice on best practice.
Jan, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Tim, did you want to?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. Jan, you talked about retention, development of public trust being being absolutely vital. But how important is it, and you talked about automated processes and so on, how important is it, though, to demonstrate that there is still a human in the loop in all of this?
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself, Tim. The human in the loop is the secret to it. We have to have systems that are auditable, that people understand how to review. Now, that may not be ourselves. We may have to get another expert in to perform that review, but that process of having a human in the loop is essential. We cannot have systems that are left unmaintained. The coefficients and the numbers that are used to drive this learning changes. And as we've seen with the current situation around COVID-19, more than ever, we need those changes to be very rapid and up to date. So it is really important that we do that. And as we look forward into the future, we'll see that probably becoming more standardized, more specific. But as David said in the previous discussion, we don't want to necessarily introduce new legislation. We just want people to use the quality assurance processes that they're already familiar with and encourage that behavior. And that can be helping our leaders in business to understand what it is that they're investing in and how this technology can actually help. And with that, we'll become better systems in the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right, we move on to our third speaker, which is Charles Radclyffe, who is head of AI at Fidelity International. Charles, 5 to 6 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, and good evening to everyone who's joining. I should probably start by saying that I've actually moved on from my role as head of AI at Fidelity, believing at the beginning of this year that this was the time was ripe to start up a new venture. Perhaps my timing wasn't impeccable, but I'll come back to that later. My background, I've really done two things with my career so far. I've built and sold a few small tech companies and failed at one, which was a much more fun and interesting experience. And I've also worked in a senior innovation capacity, helping large financial organizations implement technology. So I was formerly the head of technology at Deutsche Bank's Innovation Lab in London, DB Labs, and as you know, most recently the head of AI at Fidelity International. I started my career though with the idea of actually going into a very different field to technology and actually pursuing law. And what drew me to that subject was really the question of the philosophical basis for why we have law, why we submit ourselves to you know, things which we don't as individuals control. But I very quickly realized I wasn't going to make any money out of that, even though I might have a lot of fun in reading and writing about it. And then many years later, when I was running a data science business in London, I realized that actually all of that training in philosophy, all that training in things like jurisprudence suddenly was becoming very relevant, because all of my colleagues who were excellent engineers and fabulously talented at processing data and doing a data analysis and building models. Unfortunately, what they didn't have was really a background in looking at ethics, considering the implications of what they were doing. And also, and to my faults, they didn't have enough support for them in addressing those things. But 10 years ago, I was very much outspoken as somebody who was talking about the ethics of technology. And if I were to be presenting at a conference, the question that would be asked is, you know, should we be discussing and considering these issues? And the response would very often be, that's somebody else's problem at some future point. But that was then, and this is now. And to me, the story has been one where our relationship with technology has broken. And the reason our relationship with technology is broken is because the level of governance that we have considered to implement around the technology has not been appropriate for the task. And I want to draw a parallel with the movements around environmental and sustainability issues, because that's very much on vogue within the investment community. The hole in the ozone layer moment for technology ethics was really the Cambridge Analytica scandal from a few years ago. A few years before that, Mark Zuckerberg was Time Magazine Man of the Year because of the role that social media had played in the Arab Spring uprising. So just 6, 7, 8 years had passed between that great crash in reputation, and obviously the Cambridge Analytica scandal wiped out quite a significant chunk of Facebook share price the day that news broke. So that was the moment where ordinary people realized that there was a problem, and yet nothing happened. Nothing really changed. But certainly more fuel was put on the fire in the debate around ethics and tech. And as I say, when I left Fidelity just a few months ago in order to start a new proposition around rating companies on their tech ethics, I was a little bit despondent that there'd been a growing momentum around issues of tech ethics, but maybe my timing wasn't right. But I've been reassured in recent weeks that maybe my timing is perfect after all, because it strikes me that situations like we have now, where technology enables us to conduct sessions like this from the luxury of our, in my case, small corner of Gloucestershire, is fantastic, enabling us to keep as much of the economy moving as we can. And yet the very technology that might enable us to end the lockdowns as quickly as possible, things like contact tracing, the focus isn't really on implementing that as fast as possible. The conversation is around the debate as to whether we should do it, whether the right controls are in place. And the question really is, do people trust technology companies and trust the technology industry to come up with the goods and the right answer? And I would argue that people don't trust this industry, the technology industry, and they have some very good reasons not to. We have some answers in this, and I would say in terms of governance, there's really a few things which people need to focus on. Firstly, a lot of conversation happens around regulatory compliance, and quite often when discussions on ethics and technology are discussed, GDPR is mentioned as being the answer. GDPR was a piece of legislation which is 4 years old now, and a lot of companies frantically try to implement that just as the deadline was passing. But GDPR is only the start of what's going to be quite a significant legislative program the European Commission is proposing around digital data and AI. And so firms need to bear that in mind and to consider that they need to have a public policy response, but they can't simply rely on what they've been doing around GDPR up until now. The other thing that organizations need to think about is actually there's a big difference between how they handle risk and safety issues. And I think some of the other speakers have already touched on these things like debiasing the data that is used to train and run models, and make sure that they're fair, making sure that models can be explainable and the decisions can be properly understood. These are very important things, but these are safety questions. These are risk questions. These are things which there's a lot of academic interest around, and there's a lot of debate around what best practice should look like. But the answers to those things are things which our technologists can control, their frameworks, their standards, their best practice. But they aren't the things which go to solve the techlash, which is really the relationship with technology that is broken, that causes such debates around things like contact tracing today. The third issue is really around...
Charles, sorry, can I ask you to draw your remarks to a close?
Certainly. So the third issue is really ethics and managing ethics. And I think this is where the investment community can look at organizations in very much the similar light they would do organizations based on environmental and sustainability credentials. There is best practice around this. It looks like having an ethics board, an ethics council, some sort of structure to manage this, and also making sure there's a feedback loop from stakeholders. But it shouldn't be overlooked, and it should be looked at in equal measure to regulatory compliance and risk and safety management. Unfortunately, it gets conflated, and I think therein lies the problem with our trust with technology today.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Tim, a quick...
Yes, just coming back to you, Charles. Do I get a feeling that you would agree with David and Jan that in the sort of safety and risk area, there is quite a lot of appreciation of the need to have standards and so on as regards the introduction of AI, but not so much agreement where it comes to in terms of overarching ethical frameworks, ethical advisory boards. So you don't think quite so much progress, I mean, seen certainly from the investor point of view, you don't think quite so much progress has been made yet?
Absolutely. I think the risks are quite opaque. So when you look at an organization and you assess the level of the breadth and depth of its governance, quite often you might consider to what extent is it involved in a regulatory public policy conversation, or to what extent does it have some technology controls? Does it have a model inventory in place? Does it have some of the things that Jan mentioned earlier? But some really best practice around ethics is yet to emerge. And I think the investment community could do a lot to learn from what we've done around ESG as a way of evaluating what are the risks that firms might pose from environmental sustainability and governance, and I think we can apply that to this question of ethics. And the sorts of problems I'm talking about are application type problems. Cambridge Analytica was not a failing of engineering; it was a failing of ethics. And when Barclays hit the news in the start of this year because they were launching an employee tracking solution, it wasn't because it was badly engineered it hit the news. It was because that application of technology is questionable. And it's that governance. How do you, as a firm, implement this technology and have those controls in place? How do you ensure you're having the right conversations with stakeholders? And how do you, as a board, control those risk levers? That's what I'm talking about when I refer to ethics. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. All right, we move on. And next I'm going to invite Dr. Zoe Webster, who is Director of AI and Data Economy at Innovate UK. Zoe, if I could invite you to give us 5 or 6 minutes from your perspective.
Sure, thank you very much. So as you say, I'm Director for AI and Data Economy at Innovate UK, which is part of UK Research and Innovation. I've personally got a background in developing machine learning technology, but in some of the earlier days when it was far less trendy. So UK Research and Innovation has been engaged widely with businesses and academics to understand how we should be investing and supporting AI research and innovation, given its potential economic and societal impacts. As the UK's National Innovation Agency and as part of UK&I, our take on these questions posed kind of concerns the conditions under which business-led innovation might be enabled or accelerated through the use of AI, and how AI innovation itself might be supported. So clearly the impact of AI will not be limited to a single sector or solely to the firms that develop and produce AI tools and technologies. Many sectors, as we heard, have started to identify and pursue specific opportunities to use AI to boost productivity in their specialised processes, for example, to make investment decisions, or to, in another area, optimise manufacturing throughput, or to increase their competitiveness and sales through the development of new or improved products, processes and services for the market. For example, to develop more personalised financial products or personalised legal services. But despite UK strengths, we're not seeing AI adoption at pace or scale more generally. As of 2017, adoption of AI by UK firms was lagging behind those in the US and Europe. Elsewhere in Europe, and in the current outbreak, adoption of digital technologies generally, especially those for connectivity, is being accelerated, and that's, we're hearing that from a number of areas. But the UK still needs to boost its comparative position. Our engagement with businesses across all sectors before the outbreak led us to conclude that many businesses, even many of the larger corporates, are not reaping the full benefit of adopting AI within their general but critical business processes. For example, business development, customer services, HR, etc. And we think this represents a significant and growing market, particularly as now, during and after the crisis, there is going to be a shift in focus to resilience on top of productivity and competitiveness. In particular, it's particularly timely given that many business leaders, I think, will be now more than ever aware of which data and which processes are most important to their firms. But still, bringing AI into the mix is a risk, and it is one that the public sector can help to mitigate. So through our ongoing business engagement, we've identified a number of opportunities that could unlock and accelerate AI innovation and adoption in businesses. And these include 3 areas, those around data, skills and responsible innovation. But I think they all relate to what Lord Clement-Jones said earlier about how you operationalise all this. So first of all, data is rarely found in neat and curated sets, or the type generally required for AI deployments. I know that personally. And following on from what Jan mentioned earlier, we reckon up to 80% of the cost of an AI project is spent on kind of data engineering. So obtaining the right data sets, cleaning and organising data, arranging test and training data sets, etc. If we can improve the productivity of the data engineering process through research and innovation, then that could decrease the costs of AI projects, enable freeing up data scientists to focus on pressing concerns such as understanding and accounting for any embedded biases in data. So I think that's something we should look at, and that should open up AI for corporate decision making more widely, I would suggest. On skills, data scientists are often the role most associated with AI. They're in high demand and short supply. They attract eye-watering salaries, and for many businesses that puts them out of reach. That is one issue, but another is that the skills needed to successfully operationalise AI, so embedding it into a functioning business without disruption, goes beyond the pure technological understanding. It demands knowledge and expertise in areas such as design, social sciences, the humanities, to ensure that AI innovation and deployment is effective for the business and responsible. And by responsible, we mean that AI deployment should reflect and support human and societal values, be designed for user privacy, transparency, for example, explainable to those it impacts, and to limit unjust or irrational bias, to make it reliable, robust, safe and secure. As mentioned earlier, there is a wealth of frameworks on ethics, and the UK leads the way in this. To support businesses looking to innovate responsibly and to operationalise, Innovate UK has worked with the British Standards Institute to develop a publicly accessible standard on responsible innovation, to provide guidance and to help business leaders achieve the benefits of their innovation, and to identify and avoid or mitigate any potential harms or unintended misuse. It provides a standardised approach to identification of benefits and possible harms, to weighting them, to recording them, to iterating them, and importantly, to communicating them. It helps businesses to consider the impact of an innovation on the business itself, on customers and suppliers, on investors, on the wider society and environment. This is going on previous point, this has been heavily inspired by those in the investment community. So we're taking a position, so we're not taking a position on whether something's responsible or not, but we're encouraging the thinking to be done. And we think this will go some way to helping corporate oversights. Just a brief thing is, I'm looking at a policy for how we use AI in our processes and to support our decision making. We're starting to pilot in areas such as assigning assessors to grant applications. And I critically believe as part of that, equality, diversity and inclusion is a really key agenda we should be looking at here to make sure deployment of AI is effective and works for everyone. Thank you.
Zoe, thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. Tim, I'm sure you have a follow-up.
Zoe, thank you very much indeed. Really interesting from your perspective at Innovate UK. But do you think, and this is sometimes an issue that people do raise, is there a conflict in a sense between acting responsibility and the ability to innovate quickly, effectively, and so on? Because sometimes people raise the contrast maybe with some other nameless countries that have less constraints on, if you like, the ethics of how they do things.
I'm not sure there is a trade. I think it depends on the timescale you're looking at. Obviously, the cost of getting something very wrong could be expensive for a business, but expensive for a whole industry. And we can look at other technologies in the past that have been slowed down significantly because perhaps the investment didn't go in at the start, making sure that we had buy-in and things were thought through. And that's part of the reason why we've put this guidance together to speed up, give businesses something they can pick up and use quite readily, to enable them to innovate quickly, but to make sure they're thinking through the whole process before they make some very expensive and time costly mistakes. So I think that there's a slight trade-off, but I think we're looking to make that much faster than it would ordinarily be.
Excellent, thank you. Very good, right, we move on to our fifth presenter, which is Dr. Christine Chow. Christine, are you there? You're head of Asia and Global Emerging Markets at Hermes Investment Management, I hope.
Thank you very much. I'm also the head of technology in the engagement team for Federated Hermes. Federated Hermes is listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and we are one of the early investors who focus on stewardship and responsible investment. So very recently, we have reached $1 trillion of stewardship assets focused on responsible investing in ESG. So just in terms of giving the evidence, global M&A volume has increased from $2 trillion a year after the global financial crisis in 2009 to $4 trillion per year between 2015 to 2019. Investments in the UK tech sector concentrated on fintech, AI, and clean energy soared to £10 billion in 2019, securing a third of the 30 billion raised in Europe. So what is attracting these funds to the UK? I believe that corporate adoption of AI innovation plays a significant role amongst other sort of institutional benefits that the UK has. According to McKinsey, AI has the potential to create up to $6 trillion in value annually. And when it comes to corporate decision-making and investment, AI can benefit businesses in three key ways. First, it helps to identify opportunities. Keyword searches and news screens identify strategic fit and funding needs that help potential acquirer build a pipeline of targets. Second, AI improves due diligence insights. Regulatory technology, or RegTech, enables near real-time legal and tax compliance checks that helps to quickly establish the potential liability of a company. AI supports document management, which David mentioned earlier, and processing for transactions. So big data-led factor analysis assess the intangible qualities such as corporate culture and customer trust. Location and asset level data, such as satellite images and on-site sensors, help to collect and process data directly rather than relying on outdated disclosure-based methods. So increasingly in responsible investment, we're trying to measure and gather more data to assess this. Third, AI strengthens scenario analysis. Interactive data visualization helps decision makers to get past the noise of big data and makes analytics more agile. So these are the upsides, but upsides can be better captured with success if the risks are managed. We've heard from previous speakers about the various risks related to ethics and governance. So on a day-to-day basis, I engage with companies around the world, especially technology companies, but also companies that are leveraging technology, which basically in almost every sector on these issues. So for example, quantifying trust and culture, such as the examples I've shared earlier, require a very conscious choice of proxy indicators to measure them. The indicators may not fully capture what needs to be assessed. So decision makers, including some of the board members that are providing oversight, should understand the rationale and limits of those indicators using big data. So to do that, first, they must strengthen their knowledge of statistical methods. It's good to have an AI board, AI ethics board, but when it really comes down to is to really understand what data is being used and what methods are being used to measure them. AI analytics is often associated with margin of error or degree of confidence in the results. What does 90% accurate mean? How would statistics and probabilities impact corporate decisions and pricing? This goes beyond the basic understanding of false positives and negatives that are often mentioned. Statistics course refreshers can help decision makers more confidently challenge the recommendations presented to them, whether at the executive level or at the board level. Second, to manage AI-related risks, companies should map out group AI footprint and to establish an inventory of algorithmic models with board oversight for governance. This ensures group-wide consistency and the efficient use of resources. Companies should publish AI principles that reflect business strategy, demonstrating to stakeholders its commitment to be transparent and accountable when using big data and AI. The principles are an integral part of shaping corporate culture and conduct. Technology leaders such as IBM have been publishing ethical AI reports and use cases since 2014. HSBC, for example, published their ethical AI principles in February 2020. They mark the beginning of a journey of ethical AI integrated into business decision-making at all levels, which we encourage. And to finish off, I just want to say that in our company, we have been pushing for, when we engage with companies, we've been supporting and encouraging other investors to better understand and to support improved data AI governance throughout organizations. And we've been publishing various papers with different stakeholders. And most recently, we presented this as a new ESG theme at the Principles for Responsible Investor London Forum. And I'll be very happy to share further information if anyone is interested. Thank you.
Christine, thank you very much. Very interesting indeed. Tim, I'm sure.
Yes, I mean, Christine, you're a great proponent of ethical stewardship and responsible investment. But do I detect a small fissure between you and Charles in terms of how you see ethics adopted corporately? I mean, Charles seemed to be saying that risk and safety, those sort of more granular aspects, were rather separate from the overarching need to have if you like, an ethical code, ethics advisory board, and so on. I mean, you see it as a more integrated process by the look of it.
Well, I think in some ways we have been focusing on different aspects of how to operationalize AI ethics. And I think in different sectors and different industry, some of the safety aspects and risk aspects would be more important than the applications of it, such as Cambridge Analytica. So it depends on the business model, it depends on the applications. And that's why we said that irrespective of what the company does in whichever sector, it is important to map out where big data and AI is used. And there's an element of using third-party analytics, because a lot of the AI products or AI analytics of any companies is built on the AI platform of a tech firm. So there is a supply chain elements of third-party risk there as well. So I think it is good to start off with an overarching principles to educate not only investors, but also within the firm. It's about educating your own employees and contractors of where the risks may lie, and then it can then go into more specific aspects like what Charles has mentioned. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Right, we are moving on to our penultimate speaker, which is Naomi Climer, who is the co-chair of the Institute for the Future of Work. Naomi, if I could invite you to address us for sort of 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. So I'm an engineer by profession. My career's been in industry, mainly at the BBC and Sony, both in Europe and the US. These days, as well as being co-chair of the Institute for the Future of Work, I'm vice president at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and I'm also a non-exec director on a few tech company boards. But with my Future of Work hat on, the Institute for the Future of Work is an independent charity, and we're on a mission to make work better and fairer. And we are looking at how technology impacts work. And right now, as I'm sure you're well aware, during a pandemic, the impacts of technology have been really accelerated, and they're more visible than ever. And we are seeing some very hasty implementations of technology, things like people tracking in offices, that could end up being a mixed blessing. So we're watching all of that. We're particularly looking at data-driven technology, including AI. And one of the things in our research that quickly emerged for us around AI is equality, which has come up quite a lot today already. We recently published a research paper on artificial intelligence in hiring, as well as an equality through transition paper. And we're very pro-technology and pro-AI, actually, for the positive impact on productivity and on the economy, and so on people's work. But we have concluded a number of things. And even though we were looking at hiring and more worker-related AI, I'm certain that these lessons apply equally to AI for investment. You know, number one, it's really important to be very clear what it is that the AI is trying to achieve, what its purpose is. For investment, are you trying to boost innovation? Are you trying to get one particular region going? Are you trying to make money quickly? Are you trying to create money in a longer term, more sustainable way? And the answers to those questions will change the kind of AI that you implement. So being clear about that up front and consulting all of the stakeholders, not just shareholders, not just executives, but employees as well, is an important part of getting that right. And then again, this has come up a fair bit, but it's really important to audit that to make sure it's doing what you thought it was going to do. And to do that through the lens of equality, as well as the usual other checks like fairness, accountability, sustainability, transparency, and data protection. So not only do you check it's doing what you thought it was going to do, but you make sure that it isn't accidentally biased or coming up with unhelpful results in some way. And one of the things we found is that although there are quite a few shelf audit tools, a lot of them are based on US law or other things that mean they don't do that great a job. So it's kind of important to really challenge your AI and make sure that it is doing what you want and doing it fairly. In the case of investment, if you really want to innovate and push new boundaries, if you don't check that you're really doing that, you may well find that you're just investing in all the ways you've always invested and it won't drive anything new. The next thing we found in our research, which did surprise me because it seems rather obvious, is how important it is to actually take action on the results of your audit. So I was a little shocked by how many companies did a perfectly acceptable audit, discovered horrendous bias in their AI, but used it anyway because it was what they had and it kind of got a result, and they just did it knowing it was unfair. And that troubles me. So taking action on your audit is important. And then finally, having a human expert in the loop, which has come up before, is really important. The ICAEW research also talks about this, and especially if AI is being used in any way to replace headcount, it's important to have some human involvement. So finally, just in terms of what that means for parliamentarians, really it's about helping to find a structure and a framework for people to work within. You know, actually we've got things like the Equality Act, and people quite often forget to think of that in terms of AI, but it's easy to fall foul of that act with AI if you're not checking for it. So legal compliance with all of the usual suspects, equality, fairness, accountability, and so on. So some codes and guidance for that, some professional and industry standards, and the impact assessments and audits. And you know, there are bodies out there like the government's Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation that could certainly help to produce some of that guidance. And the Institute for the Future of Work is really keen always to develop projects in partnership, so we'd be happy to be involved in that too. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Naomi. Tim.
Yes, Naomi, thank you very much. That was absolutely spot on. But you're a very proud engineer. But I really just wanted to ask you the question, which partly derives from Charles's use of the philosophy word, you know, with his background. I mean, are we confident about turning our engineers into philosophers, into ethicists, so that we have ethics by design, which is kind of embedded in the way that they think? I mean, how far along that road are we?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are a little way along the road. I mean, I agree with Charles. I'm much more exercised about the ethics than about the technology. On the whole, we can crack the technology, but there's some really difficult human problems. And so in engineering circles, in engineering academia, they're beginning to bring all sorts of new disciplines into the engineering curriculum, but also to encourage lots of cross-discipline activity with many of the other departments in the university. It's beginning to be well understood that actually with every engineer, you do need someone in the humanities. And I know some universities like UCL, I think, are experimenting with bringing in engineering undergrads who don't have the usual mandatory physics and maths, but maybe just have one of those, but may have a language or something else. So I think it's understood that that's required, but it's easy to get drawn so deep into the engineering. And actually, if you're not thinking about the human impacts, or at least working alongside someone who's going to keep reminding you about them, then it's easy to slip that up. So we kind of all need to engage in it.
Great. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Right. I'm now going to call on our final speaker, who is Sanu de Lima, who's Deputy Director, Corporate Governance, Responsibility and Diversity, Business Frameworks Directorate. It's quite a long title. At the Department for Business and Industrial Strategy. Sanu, are you there? Perhaps just a brief word on your what you do at BEIS first.
Yeah, I joined the department in September 2016. I'm responsible for corporate governance reform, aspects of responsible business, that is to say, business going beyond the rules and beyond mere compliance to be a force for good in our society. And business leadership diversity. We sponsor the Hampton-Alexander and Parker reviews on gender and ethnic minority diversity at the top of UK business. And so I approach this discussion very much as a listener and a learner, and I'm very pleased to do so. And from a corporate governance reform perspective, I am indeed interested in how one operationalizes further AI, but also, dare I say it, digitalization in line with an ethical code, because as other speakers have said, we need to maintain trust for the ultimate benefit of corporate governance and corporate decision making, and furthermore for the benefit of business and investment. And I see there as being two clumps of practical application, if you like, in the area of corporate governance. And one of those is around high volume information analysis, and how for corporates in the first instance, the application of AI could be really beneficial, partly given the increased demands on public companies when it comes to corporate reporting and the number of things they have to report on. One of the other speakers mentioned, for example, TCFD and climate-related financial disclosures. There's a lot of complex material involved in doing that. And so actually thinking about the outputs generated by AI may well assist in corporates formulating what the inputs should be in terms of the metrics and the data, because at the end of the day, they need to think about compliance as well as comparability of the information provided. There's a practical application for supervision and market supervision. And indeed, at the current time, with the COVID-19 situation, we're looking at increased flexibilities for equity raising in the market. And it's increasingly important for market supervision to be able to monitor really quick developments, for example, around flexibilities for preemption rights in terms of raising equity. Another practical application, of course, is around audit. And as my team and the department starts to look further at how. And then, of course, there's a stewardship element to this. And the gathering of information to make really important investment decisions. And that information is just growing, and investors really need much better, comparable, meaningful information in order to make fair and effective stewardship decisions. The second area where I think there's interesting application is around process, and thinking about AI as a process management tool. One area that comes to mind is around shareholder intermediation and the increasingly complex investment chain that involves proxy voting and other decision-making bits of the investment process. And I would be interested in any future application of AI that managed to streamline that and make that more cost effective. And the last area that I would want to mention and touch on is board effectiveness, and how perhaps AI might be able to help analyze and inform how companies are actually coming to decisions, partly around the diversity of their board and what it's made up of, but also around the process of consultation within the company, with committees, with the workforce, with stakeholders, that enable better decisions to be arrived at. So I think for policymakers and indeed for parliamentarians, we always need to think about potential for legislation or regulation or guidance to have an impact on regulation, on cost and business burdens, of course, but also in the current time, competitiveness and international competitiveness. And in thinking about practical applications for AI, from my team's point of view, we will also be thinking about the benefits for analysis, for mitigating risk, but also risk-taking and innovation on the part of companies and investors. And around all of that, of course, is going to be governance around the technology itself. Because if we move forward on the basis of supporting business growth and competitiveness, policy challenge has to be maintaining accountability, transparency, and ultimately trust. Thank you, Stephen. I'll leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Tim, I'm sure
final question for me, Stephen. Sanu, you were very instrumental with the new stewardship code in the amendments to that. And obviously you have a huge amount to do with the corporate governance code as well. I mean, this is a very fast moving situation, and you've talked about some of the new tools that are available in terms of non-financial audit. I could mention AI impact assessment and so on. I mean, do you think that actually already we should be starting to think about revising those codes so we actually embed those kinds of the requirement for those kinds of tools within those codes?
I would balk slightly at revising them quite so soon until, I think we ought to bed in, but that's not to say that we can't be fostering and encouraging best practice, because both of these codes are not simply about, achieving the baseline compliance, but particularly the stewardship code is meant to reward and acknowledge excellence. And this isn't just about aspirational policy statements when it comes to stewardship, but actually investment decisions based on a solid track record. And this is why I would support other speakers who spoke about the need for AI to supplement human judgment and human decision making. And when it comes to stewardship, the information that might be generated from AI needs to support real-time, real-life human interaction and conversations. Because at the end of the day, that is what's needed if one is to innovate and to do something different, dare I say it. It also needs to be there when it comes to moments of crisis, such as this. It's been in the headlines quite often, as it usually is, the subject of executive pay. And the department has been urging companies to think about exercising restraint and discretion when it comes to executive pay in light of the wider financial strains and burdens that a company and its employees might be facing. Now, if the technology and the analysis perhaps generates one particular answer based on last year's performance, an investor really needs to revisit that information and think about, well, where is the discretion or restraint needed to be exercised here despite that information?
Thank you.
Excellent. Right. We've got approximately just under 20 minutes now for questions. But before I open up and go to Desiree to ask for questions from our attendees, I just want to know if there are any questions from panelists to other panelists or from our advisory board to anyone. So I think you have the ability to unmute yourself. So if you have a question, now is the time to ask it.
I had a question. So,
Birgitte.
yeah, My question is mainly to those who are involving in the kind of the models for making decisions. That's possibly most to Jan, but maybe also to Christine Shaw. Literally, so when we really get to the grip to when we make decisions for investment, one of the major aspects which we have been working on in the Big Innovation Center is the issue of intangible assets. And we worked with the Office of National Statistics, the Intellectual Property Office, and the Bank of England on how, in investment decision-making process, how we value companies, how we credit score companies, and lots of the issues. If you had the problem for the UK over the years have been that we're not very good in valuing software, business models, networks, economic competences, data, information systems, but we value much easier physical assets. So to what extent do you think using AI, that artificial intelligence will actually help us with creating better financing models for decision making, or is it really about the technology? So it's more like old wine and new bottles.
Thank you very much for that question. As I mentioned during the evidence giving speech, there are already some use of big data and AI to help measure intangible assets. So the two examples I've given was customer trust and let me just look back on that. So they were quantifying trust and also appropriate corporate culture. I mean, these are examples that are already in existence based on some of the analytics providers that I've been speaking to. So, and that's why I brought up the issue of what is the components of that measurement. Then the customers or management would need to have the understanding. It's not just about buying a product that says, oh, it measures customer trust and it gives you a number, but it's understanding what is the underlying components as a proxy measurement of that is important. So because there will always be variations of what represent customer trust or what represent good culture, and it would differ amongst companies. So what I'm saying is that it is possible, but it needs to be understood of how it comes to a specific indicator or assessment role in order for that to be used properly. Thank you.
And just building on that a little bit, we also have the opportunity to use things like blockchain to identify, for example, in the digital rights and media world, how the different aspects of a particular portfolio might be valued, for example. So there are ways that we can use trust in a different form using technology, not AI per se, but using technology to solve the same problem. I think the risk we have is around leaping to an assumption that you can use, for example, things like the influence of social media or things like that to try and calculate a value. I think that's a very dangerous area where it can be manipulated very easily. So we do have to be cautious about how quickly we leap into the idea of an intangible asset valuation. It is something currently really done by hand by professionals, but it is something we can see outliers and mechanisms to help us use processes to automate some of the things we're doing, but it's not yet at a point where we can simply use the tools as a valuation mechanism in the same way as we can with fixed asset registers of heavy equipment, etc.
Great. Thank
Hello,
you very much.
Stephen. Hi, it's Maria here.
Hi, Maria.
From PwC. I have a question as well. Very interesting debate, and thank you, the panelists and the speakers, for challenging us. I don't think I've heard a conversation where risk and ethics and audit was mentioned in the same sentences many times. So I think we are onto something good. But the question is we can't really audit until we understand the relationship between risk and ethics. So what is risk to ethics and ethics to risk? And the second one, we can't really audit until we have some good practices on an end-to-end AI governance process. And I would like, any of the panelists to comment and give me some thoughts around the topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Anyone want to pick up on that?
Thank you, Maria. It's a great question. I think one of the problems with ethics is that it's such a subjective conversation about, you know, do I feel that this is right, or do I feel that someone is crossing a creepy line with the application of technology? And I think somebody has asked a question on the chat. Well, people have been giving evidence as to, you know, what's the dimension that we might consider as well on an international level. So how might somebody in China feel towards an application of technology will be different to how someone will feel here in the UK. The problem, as I say, is that ethics is probably the most subjective conversation, and this is really why comparing companies and their approach to ethics has been so difficult, because it is such a subjective thing. And it would be like saying, you know, does one company or another company, which is a better logo? Does Samsung have a better logo than Apple? It's a meaningless question, and it in no way could influence really a consumer making the choice of how they feel towards an organization, or an investor in deciding whether a stock is well priced. I think that really that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about looking at ratings. Is what we can establish is what best practice look like as a set of governance activities. And so when you look at ethics, when Christine mentioned HSBC has published a couple of pages on ethics. You know, lots of companies have done this. I would argue that, you know, those are marketing exercises. You know, publishing principles which are, you know, fairly uncontroversial doesn't really translate us into, does this organization really have a depth of governance that's going to protect consumers, protect customers, protect investors from making mistakes. I think if you look at it from a governance perspective, if you look at all the different aspects of governance which need to be in place to manage the regulatory conversation, the risk and safety conversation, and also the ethics conversation, if you look at it from a governance perspective, then you can measure how well a company is doing towards that. And if you can measure it, you can score it, and then you can manage it. And I think that's a much more productive conversation that the investment industry could be having around governance of technology than the one that we're having today.
Hi, may I just jump in as well? Thank you, Charles. And I think that it's a great question on risk and ethics. Ethics becomes real when we have to face controversial situations. So when we say that companies publishing principles, that is not the end goal. We have seen a lot of people say that you have to publish principles, but that is only really the first step. And usually we leverage it as a way to engage further with companies, because those principles, they should be applied to different business applications. And the next step of discussion, in which we are creating some sort of assessment framework within Federated Hermes, the way we engage with company, is the way they come up with use cases, case studies, and the challenges that if a company is willing to share what challenges they have in applying those principles and how they create solutions or partial solutions to overcome them, we feel that they are being transparent and honest about the struggles that they have to deal with. And that is one of the ways of facing the ethical dilemma that often tend to happen when applying AI. It's not so straightforward. It's actually very, very complicated. And sometimes different principles contradict with each other. And by urging companies to start with principles, come up with case studies, and then explaining the challenges and how they explain, how they make improvements is a journey that we should be open-minded to go along with them as a responsible investor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to go to Desiree and ask if we have got some questions that we have selected from the wider audience.
Yes.
Just before I do that, you will obviously note from the clock that time is always our enemy, so we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that people may wish to ask out there. But Desiree, do we have a question you think is particularly pertinent?
Yeah, the first one comes from David Elliman.
Hi everybody, it's Dave Elliman here I'm Global Head of Technology for ThoughtWorks. My question is that I feel that the lineage of data and the systems that manipulate them are incredibly important. Firstly, it's like herding cats, there's so many moving parts. And I wonder if people feel that we should industrialize the versioning of both the data sets and the models that are used into some sort of clear ability to replay something that said a particular decision was made and the following versions were used front to back, soup to nuts. And secondly, if that's not bad enough, the actual decisions that were made by the models, I hear a lot about explainable AI and so on. It's an absolute minefield, and I put it to the learned panel that it's incredibly difficult, and I wonder if it'll ever be actually achievable to have a fully explainable AI.
Thank you, David. That is a great question. Who from our panel would like to comment briefly on that? Yeah, Charles.
Two great questions, David. So I'll try and make this brief. I think there's a real obsession from the tech community, from the engineering community, particularly around explainable AI, and I think it's a very interesting research question, and I'm sure that's why a lot of people want to try and solve it. But I think it's the wrong question to be asking, and I think this is really where the governance processes need to be better in organisations, so that investment money is flowing to answering the right sorts of questions, and not the things which are interesting research but not actually going to help you. A much more useful thing to answer when you're implementing AI is, can you replicate this answer? You touched on this around data lineage, and I mentioned the European Commission and some of the legislative thinking that's happening over in Brussels over the last few months. There's some nice seeds over there being planted around what future data governance might look like from a data audit and data controls perspective. And I think, and I added this in my written submission, if you can replicate an answer, it's much more useful to you, I think, as an organization than whether you can explain an answer. And I said a capricious AI system that's well documented is inherently useless. And we should really focus on replicability, having a system which we can't explain, but consistently gives the same answer given the same inputs, is a much more useful thing to look at. So it's an excellent question, and I'd be very happy to talk about that further afterwards with you.
Thanks, Charles. Desiree, have we another questioner?
The next one is Katerina Jonu.
Katerina, are you there?
Hello, I'm Katerina Joannou. I'm responsible for capital markets policy at ICAEW. So I have a question which I apologise from now will not contain any engineering terms. It's a question for probably for Jan, and then from the investor stroke governance perspective. So my question is, what characterises the companies that are good at identifying unconscious bias in their data and cleansing it, from your experience with clients? And then from an investor's point of view, what factors do investors currently get confidence from that the AI used in the data of companies has been cleansed from bias?
I think there's very good questions there, Katerina. I think the way that companies are addressing the issue around bias is often by actually explicitly having the dimension, the piece of information that indicates, for example, male or female gender. Obviously, we don't put that into the machine and try and predict an answer. That would be bias. But what we do is we reverse that and extract it out. And we try to work out, if you were to make the males females, females males in the same data set, do you see a bias in the remaining pieces of information which are more subtle than the information on gender, for example? So you could find, if you had an insurance piece of information, you may be having a bias towards women drivers, perhaps. And if you reverse the information in the gender, if you still see a bias, that in effect can give you a measure which you can adjust your algorithm. And that's something that software is actually starting to address now. So a number of big companies are putting in fairness tools that help people understand how they can use bias or how they can work around that bias and identify if there is inherent, for example, racism in the underlying data set, or gender bias in recruitment, for example, or any number of different areas. So it's a really interesting subject. It's very hard, but it does make sense, and it is something you can attempt to approach. The issue is that in almost all cases, the data quality is so terrible that this isn't really possible. You can't consistently apply this in corporate data. Unfortunately, the bigger problem we have is the quality of the data that corporates store and manage and use. And in the case of sales data, for example, this can be much, much worse than explicit payment data when things are actually happening. I've actually forgotten the second half of your question. Katrina, would you like to repeat the second piece?
Okay. It was about, I think, from an investment perspective.
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah. I think at the moment it's too early for us to really say with confidence that people are buying businesses purely off the back of the algorithms that they have within them. I think there's an aspect of review of those algorithms which is being conducted, and I think in the future what that'll be is a process of peer review that gets done by an independent in advance of any transaction you might want to consider. I think in the situation where you have a couple of weeks to buy or sell a company, it's very, very tight, and it's very difficult to do a very detailed analysis of a complicated system. What I think the way to address that issue is to see longer term whether there's a process for independently reviewing that through some third party to allow others who are looking at then approaching that organization and making an acquisition to then have the confidence they know it's worth investing in. Obviously, that only limits certain types of transactions, but I think that's realistically the only way that it would really be put in place, given the complexity of some of these algorithms that we're talking about.
Thank you. Christine, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I was going to mention that data is obviously an issue. So I agreed with what Charles earlier was saying, that it's something that is provided by the analytics model. If it's consistent, it's actually much more important. And also I want to supplement, Jan has given a fantastic explanation already, but I want to supplement that when it comes to data, we often hear that data is not good enough, so we just need more data. But, and some of the techniques that are being used, such as the generative adversarial network generative technique, could also exacerbate or amplify the bias as well. So it is important when doing due diligence or understanding of how AI is being applied, what data enrichment techniques that are being used, and to understand whether that actually could create biases that originally didn't exist or originally was not so significant, but then it was amplified by manipulation of that information. So I don't want to get too technical, but this, and I'm not a technical person, but I understand that through our engagement that these are some of the problems that could surface as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, time is always our enemy, and we've already gone past 7 o'clock, and I know that people have other things that they need to be doing. Can I thank all of you for your attendance, and particularly to our speakers, to David, to Jan, to Charles, to Zoe, Christine, Naomi and Sanu. Thank you all very much for your excellent input. This evening's proceedings have been recorded. This will be used to inform our next steps and to help us create reports which we then feed into government. So thank you so much for your contributions. I found it an absolutely fascinating discussion as always, and I hope to see you again at another meeting very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Panelists, thank you very much. Thank you. See you soon.